The dusk light crawled across the plains of Arkansas like a dying ember, stretching long shadows over the wooden palisades of Fort Kincaid. The year was 1870, but out here the war felt barely yesterday, its ghosts lingering in the silence between wind and rifle cracks in the hardened eyes of men who had survived too much. It was into that atmosphere that Elizabeth Harrow stepped down from the weather-worn coach, her gloved hand trembling as she touched the red dirt for the first time. She had imagined the frontier many times, but never like this. The air smelled of pine and gun oil. The fort itself rose from the wilderness as a strange hybrid, part military discipline, part lawless trading post. Barracks stood next to gambling sheds, and behind them the forest pressed close as if waiting to reclaim everything. Men paused in their chores just to watch her arrival. She was the only woman stepping into a place where the line between civility and savagery was fragile at best. Her husband, Thomas Harrow, a gaunt and nervous merchant whose debts had chased him westward, offered a polite smile to the soldiers. But nobody was looking at him. All eyes had fixed on Elizabeth, the woman with the calm posture and the unsettled gaze, carrying the quiet elegance of someone from Boston society and the weight of something unspoken. Among those watching were the 7 men who, unknowingly, would soon be bound to her fate. Silas Ward, the taciturn trapper with a scar curling across his throat. Reverend Jasper Lowe, whose sermons rarely masked his bitterness. Becket O'Rourke, a gambler who could charm bullets out of the air. Amos Tiernan, a former Union scout with a limp and a haunted stare. Twin brothers Caleb and Carter Briggs, veterans turned ranchers. And Walter Pike, the wealthiest trader within 100 miles, whose smile never reached his eyes. Each man regarded Elizabeth with a different expression: curiosity, restraint, irritation, or something harder to name. And behind them, observing the entire scene with the discipline of a career soldier, stood Colonel Marcus Drayton. Tall, severe, immaculately dressed despite the dust, Drayton carried himself with a formality that made others straighten their posture in his presence. Yet even he felt something shift when Elizabeth lifted her gaze toward him. There was nothing improper in her look, but there was history in it, unspoken, unformed, or perhaps not yet realized. Drayton stepped forward, offering a courteous nod. "Mrs. Harrow, Fort Kincaid welcomes you." His tone was polite, but his eyes moved sharply from Elizabeth to the 7 men behind him, as though measuring the air between them. A subtle tension flickered, brief, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Thomas Harrow cleared his throat nervously. "We, appreciate the hospitality, Colonel. I'm hoping to establish my trading operations here. Then I trust you'll find the frontier stimulating," Drayton replied. Elizabeth felt the weight of that word: stimulating, threatening, unpredictable. All of it wrapped in one. Inside the fort, daily life seemed held together by frayed threads. Soldiers drilled with inconsistent discipline. Civilians bartered with impatience. Rumors moved faster than wagons. And everywhere she walked, Elizabeth felt the 7 men's presence, sometimes afar, sometimes near, sometimes so close she could hear the subtle catch of breath behind her. In the trading hall, Walter Pike introduced himself with the warmth of a man used to being obeyed. "The frontier can be unkind to gentlefolk," he said. "If you're in need of assistance, I'm always around." In the chapel, Reverend Lowe's voice dropped to a murmur as she passed, as though a forgotten memory had startled him. "A woman changes the rhythm of a place," he told her cryptically. Becket O'Rourke tipped his hat with a grin that lasted too long. "Careful, ma'am. Folks out here hide more than they reveal." Silas Ward merely stared, his silence more intense than any greeting. Elizabeth could not explain the sensation rising within her each time one of them spoke or glanced her way. It was as if she had stepped into a narrative already in motion, one that had been waiting for a missing piece. That night, as lantern light flickered across the walls of her new quarters, she sensed something unsettled outside. She moved to the window. The courtyard was quiet, yet she felt watched, not with malice, but with expectation, as though her arrival had not simply been noticed, but anticipated. And then she saw him, one of the 7 men, standing alone near the edge of the barracks, half hidden in shadow. His posture was still, too still, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Elizabeth's breath caught, because for a heartbeat, just one, she had the uncanny impression that he was not looking at the fort or at the night sky, but directly at her, and that he recognized her, even though they had never met. The morning air in Fort Kincaid carried a sharp bite, the kind that made breath curl into ghostly ribbons. Elizabeth stepped out into the yard just as the sun broke through the fog, casting long shafts of gold across the parade grounds. The quiet should have been peaceful, but there was a tremor in it, a tension she could sense even if she could not name. Colonel Drayton noticed it too. He stood near the flagpole, watching the men ready their rifles. His face was disciplined as stone, yet something in his expression hinted at unease, a feeling he rarely allowed to surface. When he saw Elizabeth approaching, he straightened his posture, not to impress, but as though preparing for an unexpected conversation. "Mrs. Harrow," he said with a measured nod. "I trust your first night was tolerable?" "Tolerable," she repeated, choosing her words. "But peculiar." "Peculiar how?" She hesitated. Telling him she had seen one of the men staring at her through the dark felt too personal, too uncertain, and yet she sensed Drayton already knew something was amiss. "Perhaps it was only the silence," she said softly. The colonel studied her with the gaze of a man who had spent decades analyzing the smallest shifts in human behavior. Elizabeth suspected he heard more in her answer than she had spoken. What she did not notice was that behind her, Reverend Jasper Lowe was watching. The Reverend's hands tightened around his Bible as though it were the only thing steadying him. His lips moved silently, reciting a verse she could not hear, and when she turned he offered a polite nod. Too polite, too deliberate. "Mrs. Harrow," he greeted, "the fort is blessed with your presence." Elizabeth felt no blessing in the way he spoke. Instead, it sounded like someone recalling a warning. Later that morning, while Thomas Harrow busied himself with inventories and invoices, Elizabeth walked toward the trading hall. She wanted to familiarize herself with the people who lived in the shadow of the fort. Instead, she found the 7 men gathered in a semicircle outside, speaking in low, clipped tones. They fell silent the moment they noticed her. Beckett O'Rourke was the first to break the tension, stepping forward with an easy grin that masked something sharper underneath. "Morning, ma'am. Hope the frontier hasn't scared you off yet." Caleb and Carter Briggs exchanged a look. Quick, nervous, unfinished. Walter Pike's smile appeared again, thin and tight. Silas Ward, leaning on the corner post, just stared as though trying to place her in a memory he couldn't quite reach. But it was Amos Tiernan, limping slightly, his hat pulled low, who spoke the words that unsettled her most. "You shouldn't walk alone around here," he said. "Not until you understand the land." "Understand it how?" Elizabeth asked. Amos hesitated. His jaw tightened. "Things don't stay buried long in Arkansas soil." The others shifted, the way men shift when a truth comes too close. Before she could press further, Colonel Drayton emerged from the barracks. His authoritative presence broke the group apart instantly, 7 men scattering with unnatural speed, as though caught doing something they shouldn't. Drayton's eyes narrowed. What were they discussing? "I don't know," Elizabeth replied. "They stopped when I came." The colonel exhaled slowly. "That is precisely what troubles me." She felt a chill. "You think they know something?" "I think," he said with deliberate calm, "that those 7 men share a history strong enough to make even silence dangerous." The day passed with odd glances, unfinished greetings, whispers that seemed to stop when Elizabeth drew near. Something linked the 7 men, and somehow she now stood in the center of that connection, though she did not know how or why. By afternoon, Thomas had gone into the forest with 2 scouts to inspect possible trade routes. Elizabeth wandered the fort alone, trying to make sense of the unease around her. That was when she noticed Reverend Lowe slipping into the chapel with unsteady urgency. She followed at a distance. Inside, the Reverend knelt by the altar, clutching his Bible as though it were burning him. His voice trembled as he whispered, "She's back." But how? After all these years? Elizabeth froze. Was he speaking about her? Before she could step forward, a board creaked under her foot. The Reverend's head snapped up, eyes wide, terrified not of her presence but of what she might know. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, voice cracking. "Forgive my private devotions." But Elizabeth had seen the fear, not religious fear, not moral fear, recognition. The same recognition she'd sensed the night before. And when she left the chapel, the sensation followed her like a second shadow. Someone had known her long before she ever arrived at Fort Kincaid, even if she had no memory of them. The fog drifted low across the fort the next morning, curling around cabins and wagons like a living thing. Elizabeth woke with a start, the echo of a dream slipping through her grasp, faces she almost recognized, voices calling her name in tones both tender and threatening. And always the same backdrop: pine trees, red dirt, gunfire in the distance. A place she had never been, but that felt disturbingly familiar. Thomas had not returned yet. His absence gnawed at her, though the scouts had assured her it was common for men to be delayed in the wilderness. Still, the silence of his absence only fed the strange sense that the past was moving toward her like a storm gathering strength. When she stepped outside, the fort felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the ground itself were listening. Beckett O'Rourke was leaning against the fence near the horses, flipping a coin with restless charm. He straightened when he saw her, though something in his eyes tightened. "Morning, Mrs. Harrow. Sleep well?" "Not entirely," she answered. "I had unsettling dreams." He caught the coin in midair, fingers closing with unusual precision. "Out here, dreams are just memories that don't know where to go." She frowned. "What does that mean?" But Beckett only smiled, a smile that held too many secrets. "Ask the Reverend. Men like him collect troubled memories." Elizabeth walked on, but the words followed her like a whisper. Near the armory, Amos Tiernan was sharpening a knife, each stroke slow and deliberate. When she passed, he paused long enough to glance toward the tree line. "You heard anything?" he asked. "About what?" "About the Colonel's patrol. They found tracks near the river." "Tracks of what?" He hesitated. "Not what? Who?" Before she could ask more, Colonel Drayton emerged from behind the storehouse, boots heavy with mud, uniform damp with the chill of the morning. His expression was taut, sharper than usual. "Amos?" Drayton said. Not a word more. Tiernan obeyed instantly, lowering his gaze. The colonel turned to Elizabeth. "A quick word, Mrs. Harrow." He gestured toward the far side of the fort, where the fog was beginning to thin. She followed him to a secluded spot near the edge of the palisade. "What is happening?" she asked. "What aren't you telling me?" Drayton's jaw flexed. He folded his hands behind his back, the posture of a man restraining impulse. "There were footprints near the northern ridge," he said. "A set that did not match any of my men. Is that unusual?" "At this time of year, yes. And where they were found, even more so." She waited. The colonel exhaled. "The tracks led toward the old battlefield. The one abandoned since the war." Elizabeth shivered. She had heard soldiers speak of that place, the skirmish site choked with rust and ghosts avoided even by hunters. "What does that have to do with what's been happening here?" she asked. Drayton hesitated, a rare vulnerability. "Mrs. Harrow, those 7 men, they fought together at that battlefield under my command. And that place holds the only secret they all share." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. "A secret involving me?" Drayton met her gaze with a heaviness that suggested the truth was far more complicated than either of them understood. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they believe it does. Either way, something is resurfacing, something I thought was buried forever." Their conversation was cut short by the sudden appearance of the Briggs twins, Caleb and Carter, running toward them with urgency etched into their faces. "Colonel!" Caleb called out. "You need to see this." Drayton strode forward, Elizabeth following despite his protest. The twins led them to a spot just outside the fort walls, where the fog clung stubbornly to the ground. In the dirt lay a scrap of fabric, muddy, frayed, torn at the edges. Elizabeth knelt beside it. It was the color that struck her first. A faded blue, the same shade as the dress she had worn the night before. Her throat tightened. "This isn't mine." Carter shook his head. "We know." Caleb pointed toward the tree line. "Whoever left it wanted it found." The fog lifted just enough to reveal something else, barely visible, half buried in the soil. A footprint, small, feminine, fresh. Elizabeth felt the world tilt, the air hollowing around her, because the shape of that print matched her own perfectly. Yet she had never set foot outside the fort that morning. The fort did not breathe that day. It held its breath. News of the mysterious footprint spread quietly, not through spoken words but through glances, shifting, uneasy, deliberate. Every man who crossed Elizabeth's path looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and something colder, as if she were a question whose answer could unravel them all. Thomas still had not returned. Colonel Drayton doubled the patrols. The 7 men scattered to their separate corners of the fort, each reacting to the discovery in ways that revealed more than they intended. Some grew restless, some became withdrawn, and some, Walter Pike especially, watched Elizabeth with an intensity that made her skin prickle. By midday, the sunlight had burned off the fog, leaving a harsh brightness over the compound. Elizabeth walked toward the well, her mind spinning with possibilities. Logic told her the footprint was a threat, a manipulation. Someone wanted her rattled. But deeper inside, beneath reason, a faint tremor whispered something more unsettling. What if it wasn't a warning? What if it was a message? As she neared the well, she found Silas Ward crouched beside it, coiling rope with practiced hands. His face, usually blank as weathered stone, softened for the briefest moment when he noticed her. "You're anxious," he said. She stiffened. "Shouldn't I be?" Silas looked toward the tree line. "Fear's a scent. Folks here wear it like perfume." "That doesn't answer my question." He paused, fingers tightening around the rope. "The past has long arms," he murmured, "and sharper claws." Elizabeth felt a pulse in her temples. "What past, Silas? Yours? The others? Mine?" Silas did not answer. Instead, he stood abruptly, slung the rope over his shoulder and walked away without a backward glance. Seconds later, Reverend Lowe appeared, as if summoned by the residue of Silas's words. His face glistened with sweat, though the afternoon air was cool. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, voice trembling. "A moment?" She braced herself. I must ask," he stammered. "Do you recall ever visiting this region before?" The question struck her like a physical blow. "No," she said firmly. "I've never set foot in Arkansas." The Reverend swallowed hard. "Are you certain?" "Quite." Lowe stepped back as though the certainty itself frightened him. "You resemble someone," he whispered. "Someone from our darkest days." Elizabeth felt her breath catch. "Someone from the war?" But Lowe abruptly turned away, muttering a verse under his breath, one she could not decipher. By late afternoon, Drayton requested her presence at the officers' quarters. His message was formal, but her intuition sensed desperation behind the words. Inside, maps lined the walls, pins marking old battle routes and abandoned outposts. The colonel stood beside a desk cluttered with reports. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms tense with worry. "Mrs. Harrow," he began, "I need you to answer something plainly." "Of course." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Is there any reason at all, why those 7 men might believe they have seen you before?" Her eyes widened. "No, none." Drayton exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Then we have a grave problem, because every one of them reacted to your arrival." He paused, searching for the right phrase. "As though you were the return of someone they wronged." Elizabeth's chest tightened. "Wronged? How?" His silence was more telling than any confession. Before he could speak, a knock sounded at the door. Beckett O'Rourke entered, hat in hand, expression stripped of its usual charm. "Colonel," he said grimly, "we have a complication." Drayton tensed. "What now?" Beckett glanced at Elizabeth, then back at the colonel. Tracks were found again, this time on the south ridge. Same size, same shape. Elizabeth felt her blood cool in her veins. Drayton's voice hardened. "Show me." Beckett hesitated. "Sir, that's not all." He reached into his coat and placed an object on the desk. A small locket, tarnished by time and dirt. Elizabeth felt her knees weaken, because inside it, behind the cracked glass, was a miniature portrait. A portrait of a woman with her face. Not similar, not reminiscent. Her face. But the locket was decades old. "How?" she whispered. "How can this exist?" Drayton lifted the locket with a trembling hand, staring at it as though it were a ghost made tangible. "It was found," he said slowly, "buried beneath the old battlefield." Elizabeth's heart pounded. A portrait of her, hidden in a place she had never been, and painted long before she was born. The wind had shifted by dawn, sweeping across the Arkansas plains with a restless force that rattled the shutters of Fort Kincaid. Elizabeth scarcely slept. The locket lay on the table beside her, its cracked portrait staring back like a silent accusation. She could not look at it without feeling an ache deep in her bones, a sensation both foreign and familiar, like remembering someone else's memory. By the time the sun rose, Colonel Drayton was already at her door. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, voice strained, "we ride to the battlefield. Now." There was no room for hesitation. Something had reached a breaking point. She saw it in the colonel's eyes, in the way his hand hovered near his revolver, in the tremor beneath his calm. When they stepped outside, the 7 men were waiting with their horses saddled, each bearing the same grim resolve. Walter Pike cracked his knuckles. "Best end it today." Reverend Lowe murmured a prayer, his voice shaking. "May the Lord forgive what we did, and what we are about to face." Elizabeth's pulse thundered. "What exactly happened there?" she asked. "Tell me the truth." Silas Ward turned sharply toward her, jaw tightening. "Not yet," he said. "You'll see it soon enough." They rode in silence, hooves cutting through frost-hardened earth. As they neared the abandoned battlefield, the air grew colder, the forest darker, as if the land itself recoiled from what lay ahead. Rusted cannons lay half swallowed by weeds. Torn flags clung to skeletal branches. The ground still carried the faint smell of gunpowder, as though time refused to let it fade. When they reached the ridge, Drayton dismounted. "This place," he said quietly, "is where everything began." Elizabeth followed him toward a shallow ravine. The 7 men formed a loose circle around them, their faces hardening with each step. At the edge of the ravine, Drayton stopped and pointed. Elizabeth's breath caught. Half buried in the soil was a weathered wooden cross, its wood splintered, its marking barely readable. But even from a distance, she saw the name carved into it. Eliza M. Harrow, 1864. Her knees weakened. "That's not me," she whispered. "It can't be." Drayton's voice was low. "It's the woman you resemble, the woman these men once knew, the woman whose death they caused." The 7 men stiffened, not in protest, but in shame. Walter Pike was the first to speak, voice hoarse. "She came here a nurse, kind, too kind. We were half mad from the war, half starved, half broken. And when the raiders came, when the lines collapsed, we chose to save ourselves." Caleb Briggs looked away, swallowing hard. "We abandoned her." Elizabeth felt her stomach twist. Reverend Lowe sank to his knees beside the grave. "We buried her afterward, but none of us ever forgave ourselves." Elizabeth stared at the cross, the cracked earth. The fragments of a life she had never lived yet could strangely feel. "But why do I resemble her? Why the footprints? The locket?" Silas Ward stepped closer, his voice nearly a whisper. "Because someone wants us to remember. Someone wants to drag the truth back into the light." A branch snapped in the forest. Everyone froze. Beckett drew his pistol. "We're not alone." A figure emerged from the tree line. Slowly, deliberately, tall, wrapped in a long coat, face obscured by shadow. The men tensed, forming a protective half-circle around Elizabeth. The figure stepped closer. Elizabeth felt a chill crawl across her skin. Something about the silhouette tugged at her memory, though she had never seen it before. Drayton's hand hovered above his holster. "Identify yourself." The figure stopped 10 paces away, then lifted their head. Elizabeth's breath punched out of her lungs, because the face that stared back at her, pale, hollow, impossibly familiar, was the same face from the portrait in the locket, the same face as hers. A voice, soft and rasped with age, broke the silence. "You left me behind once," the stranger said, eyes fixed on the 7 men. "But this time, none of you will walk away." And when those words fell into the frigid morning air, every man in the clearing felt the past tighten around their throats like a noose, finally, irrevocably, closing. If this story captivated you and you want more hidden secrets from America's past, leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps us bring more dark, forbidden, and forgotten stories of the American frontier.